with a runoff in Georgia's 4th congressional district. And much of the nation's attention tonight focused on Connecticut, the Democratic Senate primary between Joe Lieberman, seeking a 4th term, and his challenger, Ned Lamont. We'll take you live to the scene at Senator Lieberman's headquarters in Hartford, the Goodwin Hotel. The polls close at 8 p.m. Eastern Time in just about 15 minutes. Throughout the evening, we'll show you the results from the Connecticut Senate race. We'll hear from those who have been watching and covering this campaign. And we'll hear from those of you from the Democratic Party, especially those in Connecticut, and what it means for this midterm elections. We are also partnering with WFSB, the CBS affiliate in Hartford, to show you how the story is playing out for Connecticut viewers. And we'll go to Meriden, Connecticut for Ned Lamont headquarters. We expect to hear from the candidates probably within the next couple of hours. As we said, the polls close at 8 o'clock Eastern Time. We expect from the Secretary of State in Connecticut to begin releasing results at about 8:35 East Coast time. And as we go to other programming tonight, we'll show you the results every 10 minutes and give you the breaking story from Connecticut and the 4th Congressional District in Georgia, where most of the attention is focused this evening. We want to remind our audience that for Connecticut voters only in the first half hour, we want to hear from you. And we are dividing our phone lines as follows. If you're a supporter of Senator Lieberman, you can call us at 202-737-0001. If you're a supporter of Ned Lamont, the number to call is 202-737-0002. And if you're a Connecticut Republican, the number to call is 202-628-0205. We want to find out from you what turnout was like during the course of the day, what this campaign has meant for Connecticut voters, and how you think this will all impact the fall election. Bob Bennison of CQPolitics.com is joining us to kind of give us his assessment of this campaign and some other races this evening. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, glad to be here, Steve.
Why did this become such a race in the middle of August?
Well, there has been signals that the Democratic base in Connecticut was pretty dissatisfied with Joe Lieberman. And this goes back to the 2004 presidential campaign. Remember that Joe Lieberman was the 2000 vice presidential candidate for the Democrats. And that was supposed to give him a pretty good base to run from when he decided to enter the 2004 presidential race. And in the early primaries in Iowa and New Hampshire, he just got no traction, and people were wondering why. And the biggest reason why was that he was regarded as the strongest and most outspoken supporter of the war in Iraq amongst all the Democratic candidates. Even some of the ones who had voted for the war resolution in 2002, such as John Kerry, who went on to win the nomination, and John Edwards, who went on to be the Democratic vice presidential nominee, but at that point had already changed their minds and thought that the war was not going right and that their votes were probably a mistake. Joe Lieberman hadn't. He wound up dropping out of the presidential race after a few weeks because he just wasn't getting anywhere. But rather than take that as a sign that he needed to address this issue with Democratic voters in his home state approaching his 2006 re-election campaign, not necessarily to change his mind or to change his views, but to explain himself more directly to the voters in his state, he pretty much went along on assuming that he wouldn't face a serious challenge in the Democratic primary. And in fact, made several strong statements criticizing fellow Democrats for taking a harsh approach with President Bush and criticizing President Bush very strongly for his decision to go to war and for pursuing the war for a much longer time than either Senator Lieberman or President Bush had suggested prior to the war. So Ned Lamont, a very wealthy businessman, decided to try and galvanize support for amongst these anti-war voters who are really expressing some dissatisfaction with Senator Lieberman, and his campaign took off pretty much out of nowhere.
Well, let me ask you a little bit about the strategy over the last 48 hours, because on Sunday, Senator Lieberman gave a speech in which he talked about why he supported President Bush and the Republicans on the war in Iraq. He outlined what it meant to be a Democrat. And on the flip side, from the Ned Lamont campaign, his schedule Sunday was left with no public information for reporters to follow. And we've seen more from Joe Lieberman in the last day or so than we have from the Lamont campaign. Strategically, what do you read into that?
Well, you could take that and say, wow, Ned Lamont was really confident that he didn't feel like he had to be out on the campaign trail or addressing the press 2 days before the primary. And on the other hand, that Senator Lieberman knew he better hustle if he was going to have any chance of salvaging this. Last Thursday, the Quinnipiac University, which is a respected polling institute in Connecticut, released a survey that suddenly showed Ned Lamont, who had a small lead in an earlier survey, winning by 13 percentage points. By Monday, that was down to 6 percentage points, which suggests there's still quite a bit of fluidity within the electorate in Connecticut, and that maybe people haven't solidly made up their minds. But it's really a pretty difficult situation for an incumbent to be in 2 days before the primary, trying to explain and get voters to change their minds about a very fundamental issue like the Iraq War.
We have two voters, both from New Haven. First, a supporter of Senator Lieberman, and then a supporter of Ned Lamont. We'll hear from them and find out what they saw and heard today. New Haven, Connecticut, supporter of Joe Lieberman. Go ahead, please.
From the New Haven, Connecticut. Been a supporter of Joe Lieberman for years. He's certainly a pioneer for the Connecticut for many years. We were upset with the fact of the matter of him supporting the war. As far as that part, that bothered a lot of people I talked to. I thought about his long history, and I decided that based on his seniority, based on his issues, supporting, at least supporting issues pertaining to women's rights, talking about the education, talking about a lot of things that were important. I didn't think it was a good idea to change the strategy of where we're going now. So it bothers me about the support of the war, but also I did support him in terms of 90% of his support of other issues that are important, civil rights issues. So we're comfortable with here anyway that I think he'll win tonight, but he got a wake-up call. Thank you.
Caller, are you still with us?
Pardon, yes, I am.
What was turnout like in New Haven at your precinct where you voted?
I voted early in the morning, and it wasn't too bad, but it was light early. But I think people really, when it comes down to Joe Lieberman's been good for labor, he's been good for health care, he's been good on a lot of issues. I think the idea of the war got everybody a little stirred up, which now where it's going now.
Okay, thanks. Another caller from New Haven, a supporter of Ned Lamont. Why are you supporting him in this Democratic primary?
I'm supporting Ned Lamont for a lot of reasons, and I think one of the messages to take home is a lot of this is about a very anti-incumbency fever that should be spreading across the nation. I think there's a tremendous dissatisfaction with what's going on in Washington, and when you get the sort of arrogance that we got with our senator over the last 4 to 6 years, it seems like ever since we ran for vice president, he got a little taste of power and then forgot about us for a while. He wasn't there voting a lot. And the bottom line is, if he's not going to listen to the people he's supposed to be representing, just see you later. That's it. Move on. Get out of the way. And Lamont is going to, basically, it's two basic issues, which are huge issues, is health. He's talking about universal health care. I wish more people would talk about that. He's talking about it. He's saying, why hasn't Joe Lieberman signed on to any major or brought up any major universal health care legislation to the Senate? What is he using his forum for?
Okay.
For the middle-class voter.
Thank you. Appreciate the call from New Haven. We want to welcome in Peter Urban, who is covering this race for the Connecticut Post. He is joining us from Hartford. What have you been hearing in the course of the day as voters go to the polls? This is a closed primary, first of all, right? Only Democrats?
Yes, that's the case. Only the Democrats can vote. There's about 700,000. And so far it looks as if about 50% are likely to go out and vote.
And I know you just joined us as we were hearing from a supporter of Ned Lamont and a supporter of Joe Lieberman. We heard the benefit of seniority versus the arrogance of Joe Lieberman as a reason to either re-elect Joe Lieberman or elect Ned Lamont. Is that what you're hearing?
Yes, it comes down to, I think, voters here feeling that they haven't gotten, the ones that are opposing Senator Lieberman are concerned that he isn't respecting their opinions, their concerns, particularly about the Iraq War, which has really been the fundamental issue here in Connecticut.
If you talk to people who are close to Connecticut politics, many have said that Joe Lieberman did not get the warnings early on, February, March, April of this year, that he was going to be in for a tough race. Can you elaborate on that? Is that what you might have heard as you followed Connecticut politics?
I think that's somewhat true. I think he's never really thought that the Iraq War was going to be such a profound issue for people. He's been basically telling the voters that, yeah, I oppose, I proposed, a unpopular position here, but you look at my entire record, and you shouldn't just vote me out for one issue. But this is not just one issue to a lot of voters. It's the issue, and it's defining this race.
Who have you seen campaigning with Ned Lamont over the last couple of days? We've seen some of the higher-profile candidates, surrogates with Joe Lieberman, but what about the Lamont campaign?
Well, I mean, the Lamont campaign is really concentrated heavily on going around and saying that they're going to be different, that they'll listen to voters here, that they'll oppose President Bush, and it seems as if he's really touched a chord with a lot of people. His events have been very, well attended and energetic, so that seems to be the case.
And Bob Benenson, what are the scenarios tomorrow morning after we find out who wins this race for Ned Lamont? If he wins, Joe Lieberman, does he run as an independent? What would determine whether or not he does that?
Well, I think seems pretty much set on doing just that. Although I think the real question will be how much pressure he's under from other Democrats, particularly his fellow colleagues, people like Senator Dodd, who may ask him to step aside and not run as an independent, based just simply on the fact that they want a unified Democratic ticket here. They've got a lot of other races that they're hoping to win as well.
Peter Urban, who's with the Connecticut Post, Bob Benenson of CQPolitics.com. What are you hearing?
Well, Senator Lieberman took a big political risk and may have hurt himself in the pre-primary polls by announcing that if he lost the primary, he would run as an independent. Now, there was a logistical reason why he had to do that if he was going to run as an independent. Connecticut, to cut down on this kind of thing, requires candidates to file petitions the day after the primary in order to qualify for the ballot as an independent in November. So if Joe Lieberman is going to do this, he has to have ready tomorrow by the close of business 7,500 valid petition signatures to get on the ballot. But the fact that he has said he is going to do this does not necessarily mean that he will. And as Peter was just saying, I think that the senator is going to come under intense pressure from both the state Democratic Party and also from the National Democratic Party to concede to a defeat tonight and to allow Ned Lamont to run unimpeded for the in the general election as a Democratic nominee. The concern is not only, or maybe not even so much, that the seat could go Republican, because the Republicans didn't nominate a strong nominee, a strong candidate to run in November. But the idea that the vote could be split, there'll be that much uncertainty, and there will be so much national focus on this division within the Democratic Party over the war in Iraq, which the Republicans could easily exploit and say, see, the Democrats are criticizing the President of the United States on this issue, but they really don't know what they believe on it. So I'm sure that Joe Lieberman is going to want to pursue an independent campaign if he loses the primary, because there are polls that show that he would either be very competitive or maybe even win. One of the interesting things in Connecticut is because he is perceived as such a centrist, and because of his position on the war, which has alienated a lot of Democratic voters, more independents and Republicans think positively of Joe Lieberman than do Democrats. So you can't say that he couldn't win as an independent, but there's going to be a lot of question as to whether he should pursue that campaign, certainly from within the ranks of the Democratic Party organizations.
Peter Urban of the Connecticut Post, does the margin of victory or defeat for Joe Lieberman determine whether or not he runs as an independent?
I think that'll have an impact here. If it's a close race, he'll have more reason to say, let's give all the voters of Connecticut a chance to weigh in on this. But if it's a real blowout, I think it's going to be tough for him to say that the voters here haven't had their say. So I think that's it does make a difference. So we'll have to wait and see just what the turnout is and how many people actually vote for him or against him.
We have a couple of other Connecticut voters on the lines. Let's hear from them. First of all, a supporter of Ned Lamont, New Haven, Connecticut. Good evening. And by the way, it's now 8 o'clock East Coast time, and the polls in Connecticut have just closed.
Yes, I voted for, can you hear me?
We sure can.
I voted for Ned Lamont because of what Lieberman said about Kerry. Said that Kerry was not good for Israel. All Lieberman does is yay, yay, Bush. And I am against the war, but he seems to undermine everything the Democratic Party does to help Bush. And that's why I voted for Ned Lamont. Go!
Thank you. Oxford, Connecticut, you're next. Supporter of Senator Lieberman.
Yes, hi. How are you tonight?
Good evening.
Good. I do support Senator Lieberman very, very strongly. I think he is a man of great dignity, and he's a man of great honor, and he believes in what he believes. We don't know what Ned Lamont believes. He's a smooth talker, and if he thinks he's going to go into the Senate and he's going to make all kinds of changes, like bring our troops home, when is he going to bring them home? I mean, he can't tell us when he's going to bring them home. So we have a man, we have a wonderful man who has stood up for Sikorsky aircraft, for many companies in this state. He is a man of great honor and great dignity, and I would rather have a man who really believes and stands by what he says and believes than somebody that we don't even know who he is. And I applaud Joe Lieberman for standing by what he believes.
Caller, before we let you go, as somebody who's watched this campaign over the last couple of months, what has it taught you about the process and about politics in Connecticut?
Well, I'll tell you, Oxford is a very strong supporter of President Bush. In our town, President Bush won, by quite a margin. I think that what it's telling us, I don't think it's just in Connecticut, but I think it's countrywide. I think it's telling us that if you don't believe, if the far left liberals, and it doesn't have to even be a Democrat, it could be anybody, if you don't believe what a very small hand of people like Senator Kennedy, Senator Kerry, Senator Clinton, the people who are really, really far to the left and who are, it seems like, being a Democrat, I don't want to be mean-spirited. I don't want to be, we should be standing united as a country. And right now, nobody is standing united as a country. And if you attack the president, then the whole world looks at us as if we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, and we look foolish to everybody.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate the call. Peter Urban, what about the attention, the national attention, that this race is getting tonight?
Well, it's been pretty crazy here. There's about 23 camera crews here. You get CNN and ABC, NBC, everybody here, C-SPAN as well. So it's been pretty wild, and as you go around the state at any of the events, the Lieberman campaign and the Lamont campaign have both been followed by reporters who are obviously very interested in this race. It's taken on a sort of a national identity as something that is really going to determine maybe the future of where Democrats go in races this November, as well as maybe 2008.
Bob Edison, I hasten to ask about 2008 because we're not even through the 2006 campaign, but what does this mean for the Democratic primary as we move into another presidential election year?
It's really hard to make any broad brush presumptions about this because there are personalities involved as well as issues. There are a lot of Democratic senators and House members who are up for election this year who supported the war resolution in 2002 and who even supported the war well into it, maybe still voice support for it, who are not in this kind of political danger. Joe Lieberman, as we were discussing before, probably should have taken a hint from what probably had in the 2004 presidential primaries and addressed these issues of, in a lot more personal terms with the voters in his state. And he might have been able to nip this problem in the bud without even changing his position. At least he would have addressed them directly, and the voters would have at least had a sense that he was listening to him. I think that's a big part of the problem, is a sense that he was doing his own thing on the war issue, and he was ignoring this big body of dissent within his state. Whether this means that only a candidate who is extremely outspoken on the war and has been from the very start will be able to win in 2008, I'm not sure it suggests that. Because if we look right next door in the state of New York, Hillary Rodham Clinton, who has been fairly hawkish, a Democrat, and did support the war resolution in 2002, and has said that we should not draw troops out of Iraq expeditiously, is an overwhelming favorite. She's a shoo-in for re-election because she has been very, very publicly critical of the Bush administration on its handling of the war. Joe Lieberman says he has criticized the Bush administration on the war, but the voice that they heard was the one who went on the floor of the Senate late last year and who wrote an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal pretty much chastising anti-war Democrats for criticizing the president over the war. And I think that was really the spark that lit the fuse. There was no Ned Lamont. There was really no strong Democratic challenger who had come forth as late as last fall. And really the sense that Senator Lieberman was going too far in their eyes to justify President Bush's actions really infuriated a lot of Democrats.
Peter Urban, I want to come back to you in just a moment to talk more about Connecticut politics. But Bob Benison, as we said at the top of our program, a number of other primaries today and a runoff in Georgia's 4th congressional district. We have some early numbers, only 4%, so still only a couple of hundred votes being counted. But as you can see, with a small number now reporting from the 4th congressional district outside of Atlanta, Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney with only 25% of the vote, compared to Hank Johnson with 75%. We should hasten to add that these numbers are, again, a small percentage of the overall vote. Your reaction, though?
Well, it's very clear that Cynthia McKinney is in serious trouble in her primary today. I'm not sure she'll end up winning a close election or wind up losing a close election, but she has been a lightning rod for controversy ever since she first arrived in Congress in 1992. She's very outspoken. She's a really fiery liberal activist. And that was always her strength as a politician because she has a loyal following of supporters who really feel that she's a herald for minorities and the poor. She's very supportive of organized labor issues, and she's been very outspoken as an opponent of the war in Iraq. But she actually was defeated for office once in a primary just 4 years ago. She had served for 5 terms or 10 years. And after the 2001 terrorist attacks, she had made a statement in which she implied that President Bush had prior knowledge of the 9/11 attacks. And that was a little bit too much, even for a lot of the Democrats in her overwhelmingly Democratic constituency. And she lost to a former state judge named Denise Majette. And you would have thought that would have done it for a while, and Denise Majette would have held the seat for a while. Well, in the middle of her first term in office, Denise Majette decided to run for the Senate in 2004. That opened the seat back up, and Cynthia McKinney made a comeback. And she won the seat 2 years ago. And during her first year in office, she was a little bit more low-key than usual, and everybody thought, oh, maybe it's a new Cynthia McKinney. Well, that all changed in March when she got into an incident in one of the House office buildings here in Washington, where she walked past a security checkpoint, and the Capitol Police officer didn't recognize her immediately as a member of Congress. And he tried to impede her, and she allegedly struck him in the chest. That led to a grand jury investigation, whether there were going to be assault charges against her. There weren't, but it just brought the whole controversial Cynthia McKinney back into the picture again. And Hank Johnson, who's a very mainstream Democrat, a DeKalb County commissioner in the suburbs of Atlanta, gave people who were dissatisfied with Cynthia McKinney and tired of the controversy, again, somebody to vote for against her. She got 47% of the vote in the primary 3 weeks ago compared to 44% for Mr. Johnson. But there's a theory about runoff elections that if the incumbent doesn't get a majority the first time, it means they're unpopular enough not to get a majority the second time, and that Hank Johnson could come from behind and win this runoff, and that could very well be what happens.
Let me put those percentages in real numbers again. 75% for Hank Johnson and 25% for Cynthia McKinney. In terms of actual numbers, that's 397 votes right now for Hank Johnson compared to 134 for Representative McKinney. And again, these are early numbers. Peter Urban, before we let you leave, what are you looking for tonight? What do you think is going to happen?
Was that to me?
Yeah, Peter Urban, what are you looking for
Yeah,
tonight?
oh, sorry. I expect to see Lamont will actually win this race. It looks like there's been quite a big turnout of voters. The absentee ballots have gone his way, and a lot of the suburban towns, there's been quite a few people out. It seems to me like it's going Lamont's way, so that's what I expect we'll see. And then we'll just have to see what Joe does in terms of whether he actually runs as an independent.
And as far as absentee ballots and new registrations, what have you seen in Connecticut over the last couple of days?
Well, the absentee ballots, most of the ones that I got reports back as far as that were counted, seem to be going for Lamont. In terms of new registrations, there were a lot of independents that switched and unaffiliated voters that came over to be Democrats, about 24,000 in the last month. So there's been a lot of attention there as to just exactly who they'll go for. No one really knows for sure.
And last question for you, Peter Urban. Some of the papers that have endorsed Senator Lieberman, including your own Connecticut Post, the Hartford Courant, the Norwich Bulletin, and the Greenwich Times, only a handful supporting Ned Lamont. Why? In their editorials.
Well, I think the editorial pages feel that Joe Lieberman has been somebody that's stood up for the state for 18 years and worked hard on a lot of very important issues, Long Island Sound protection. Certainly the defense industry here has been helped by his work on their behalf, and they're not willing to, or they don't want to throw that out with a single vote. And I think that's what their view is that the Iraq war is here, and we have to deal with that separately from what Joe Lieberman's opinion is on it.
Peter Urban, who's a Washington correspondent, but in Connecticut tonight for the Connecticut Post, covering the story with Joe Lieberman and Ned Lamont in Hartford. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
And we want to check back in a moment on the race in Georgia, but Bob Benenson, very quickly, some of the other primaries that you're watching today.
In Michigan, there's an interesting primary in the 7th Congressional District. Joe Schwartz, who's actually the oldest member of the freshman class in the House, he's 68 years old, a veteran state senator, won a crowded primary for an open seat in 2004 with 28% of the vote. He was the only moderate in the field, and the rest of the candidates who got 72% combined were all conservatives. Well, the conservatives were gunning for him this year. And this time they got a one-on-one matchup. A former state representative named Tim Walberg, who was one of the 5 candidates who ran against Schwartz in 2004. The Club for Growth, which is an influential conservative political action committee, which amongst its missions is trying to eliminate moderate Republicans from Congress and replace them with conservatives. They brand moderate Republicans as rhinos, standing for Republican in name only. And Joe Schwartz has really had to defend himself against these charges, saying that he supports the Republican agenda and supports President Bush most of the time, but that he does disagree on some issues, and has asked the voters of his district, which is a Republican-leaning district, to respect him for that. So it'll be interesting to see if the voters of that, the Republican voters of that district, go with pragmatism. Joe Schwartz has the endorsements of the state and national Republican establishment and President Bush, or if they're going to go with a more ideological approach and vote for the conservative candidate Tim Walberg. We also have primaries in Colorado, One is a crowded Republican primary in a Republican-dominated district, the 5th District, an open seat of retiring Republican Congressman Joel Heffley. Whoever wins that primary, and it'll be also probably be with a fairly low plurality, is going to be elected to Congress this November. And then in the 7th District, which by contrast is possibly the most evenly split between the parties in the country. It's almost 50-50. There's an open primary to replace Republican Representative Bob Beaupre, and the Democrats have a competitive primary there. The Republicans have already decided on their nominee, and that's going to be one of the most competitive races in the country. We have it rated on CQPolitics.com as no clear favorite.
By the way, Bob Edison will be on CQPolitics.com during the course of the evening after he leaves us here tonight, and you can check in with him. And we'll hear from some more Connecticut voters, but let's take another look back at the Georgia 4th Congressional District. Jeremy Redmond is joining us on the phone from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Jeremy Redmond, first of all, the numbers that we're seeing right now just from Gwinnett County, again, they're early numbers, but indicating that Hank Johnson is ahead 75% to 25%. Tell us a little bit about Gwinnett County and the makeup of this congressional district and what these numbers might mean for either campaign.
This is a solidly Democratic district, and it's really too early to tell how things are going right now with only 4% of precincts reporting. We spent about half the day with the candidates this morning, and turnout was extremely light. In fact, when Hank Johnson voted at his polling place in Decatur this morning with his wife at his side, there were only 2 of 3 people in the polling places this morning. But it really is, we're going to have to see how things turn out in DeKalb County, where most of the district is located.
What's the tenor of this campaign? We saw 2 debates in this runoff race, one Saturday on WSB and one last week. Right.
Since the primary, Johnson has gone after McKinney as a sort of a polarizing and ineffective congresswoman. He, during that debate Saturday on WSB-TV, he called her March 29th confrontation with that Capitol Hill police officer a quote-unquote embarrassing debacle. She has been accusing of Johnson of being part of a Republican movement to preserve control over politics in Georgia, and she's pointed to contributions he's received from a few Republicans. They've really gone after each other in recent days. But mostly it's been about tax and not the issues in recent days.
Jeremy Redmond, who is covering the story for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and we'll try to check in with you later in the night to find out what you're hearing and what this means. By the way, is there a Republican candidate in this race?
Yes, there is. In the general election, whoever comes out of the runoff is going to face Catherine Davis.
But you said it's a predominantly Democratic district?
That's right.
Okay. Jeremy Redmond, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bob Edison, we want to hear from some of the Connecticut voters, and then I want to get your assessment on what you're hearing from supporters of Ned Lamont and Joe Lieberman. First up, East Haddam, Connecticut. Go ahead, please. East Haddam, you with us?
Right here.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I just want to basically say that it was a classic case of the devil you know versus the devil you don't. And, my feeling was that if Joe Lieberman was to run as an independent, it could split the Democratic vote, which would put the state in play in terms of putting another Republican in the Senate, which is the last thing I wanted to see. I mean, one more guy in the Karl Rove, Dick Cheney school is like the last thing I need to see, in this country right now. Those people I think are really destroying the country. So I went with Joe Lieberman because I'm hoping to keep things stable. He's not my favorite guy in the world, but I think he stood up for the state pretty well. He's a little bit too far to the right for me, but Ned Lamont was a little too far to the left. So I thought I'd just, stay with my horses where they were and, hope for the best.
Thanks. Next up is New Haven, Connecticut, a Republican voter in the state. Go ahead. New Haven, you with us?
Hello?
Yes, go ahead, caller.
Hi, how you doing? I'm a Republican. I vote pretty much Republican up and down the ballot, no matter who's running for every office. Typically, I'm Republican. But philosophically, I'm a libertarian. And one of the things that I think that this primary is showing is that expanding groupthink in the Democratic Party, it appears that if you are simply in favor of anything that Bush does, even if it's not necessarily a socially conservative agenda, and you can't be a Democrat. I don't know if anybody agrees with that, but I'm also a college student, and I see the environment at universities, and it simply appears that if you do not fit the criteria 100%, as opposed to 99%, you simply cannot be a liberal.
Caller, let me ask you, will you vote for Alan Schlesinger as the Republican nominee in the general election? I think we lost the call. We'll go to Middletown, Connecticut. Good evening.
Yes, good evening. I have been listening. I agree with many of the things that Bob has been talking about in regards to the way that on several issues that Senator Lieberman has gone contrary to what the Democratic Party is for. My concern is what will occur after this primary and the potential for splitting the Democratic Party. That's my major thing that I have an issue with.
Thank you. Appreciate the call. Bob Benenson, from what you're hearing, Republicans and supporters of Joe Lieberman and Ned Lamont, what's your assessment?
Well, there's going to a lot of the immediate analysis over the next few days is going to be what impact does this have on the Democratic Party going forward. Republicans, if Ned Lamont wins, or even if he comes close, are going to echo your Republican caller a minute ago and say, see, the Democrats all want to be of one voice against George W. Bush. If you're not 100% against Bush, you're not a Democrat. And they're also going to use this to portray the Democrats as enthralled to liberal activist groups such as MoveOn.org and the blogger site Daily Kos, who really generated a lot of the interest amongst liberal activists in this race. What Ned Lamont supporters are going to say is, wait, this is just showing just how much outrage there is over this war in Iraq, how much people want to come forward, and this Lamont campaign against a very powerful senator in Joe Lieberman, who has been popular in the past in Connecticut, will liberate other Democrats and other Democratic candidates to feel freer in criticizing the president and calling for change in Iraq and also calling for change in Congress. One interesting thing, though, aside from this Iraq issue, that is a lesson that we can take from this primary campaign, and that is going to be really a concern to a lot of vulnerable incumbents in this election year because of the volatile nature of the political environment this year, is how quickly things can change in politics, especially in this kind of environment. 3 months ago, and now we're roughly almost exactly 3 months from Election Day in November. 3 months ago, Ned Lamont had a 9% voter ID, name ID in Connecticut. 9% of the respondents to a poll said that they knew enough about Ned Lamont to state any kind of opinion about him. 90% didn't. At that time, Joe Lieberman had a lead over Lamont of 65 to 19%. So it really looked like Lieberman was going to be able to survive any kind of uprising against him. Within 2 months, or a little bit more than 2 months, Ned Lamont had gone from absolutely perfectly unknown to the lead in the polls in this race. So for incumbents who figure, okay, well, they can deal with any kind of problems that they have in this particular election year, despite the bad approval ratings for Congress, besides the bad approval ratings for the president, besides the war and the economy and all these other issues that are going on out there that are creating so much political turbulence. This has to give them a little bit of pause.
We have some early numbers, and depending on how quickly they're being counted, I can tell you that we're monitoring WFSB, which right now has Ned Lamont with about 2,300 votes. This is only about 2% reporting, and Joe Lieberman with about 1,700 votes. If you put that numerically, that is about 60% for Ned Lamont, 40% for Senator Lieberman. Again, just a small percentage reporting, and we don't know what part of the state is coming in. But on first blush, what do you think?
It shows that this is going to be a highly competitive race, but as you say, there are going to be hundreds of thousands of votes cast in Connecticut today. So if this was from Ned Lamont's hometown, then his lead, 60% lead, is going to be disproportionate. If it's spread out over the state, that's going to be interesting. Because Joe Lieberman in his two previous primary campaigns for re-election didn't face any serious opposition, there's really no baseline to judge this against. I think that maybe if you look at some of the more conservative parts of the state, perhaps from the 5th Congressional District in the northwest part of the state, which is probably the least Democratic area, if you see a big Ned Lamont vote coming out of there, then you might say, wow, I think this is really a trend. But right now, since we don't know where that early vote is coming from, it's a little hard to say how definitive it is.
Bob Benison, just a minute left. What is your sense of the 3 House races in Connecticut, 3 Republicans seeking re-election in the fall?
Well, they're all moderate Republicans. Chris Shays of the 4th District, Rob Simmons of the 2nd District, and Nancy Johnson of the 5th District. They have 3 things in common. One is that they're all socially moderate, which has given them some bipartisan appeal. The second is that they all come from districts that, to some degree, supported John Kerry for president over President Bush last time out. Rob Simmons' 2nd District was the strongest Kerry district, then Chris Shays, and then marginally Nancy Johnson's. And the third is they all have strong opponents. This is particularly so for Chris Shays in the 4th District. Diane Farrell, a former mayor of one of the larger towns in that suburban New York City district, challenged him last time, held him to 52% of the vote, which was a career low. So that was a marginal district coming into the race. And Rob Simmons faces former State Representative Joe Courtney, who ran against him in 2002, didn't do so well, lost by 8 percentage points, but most local observers say he's running a stronger contest this time. And the Democrats have a state senator named Chris Murphy. He's regarded as a young rising star in the party, and he's challenging Nancy Johnson, who's pretty well entrenched. She's got a lot of influence as a Ways and Means Committee member and a lot of campaign money. But if this is a big swing year for the Democrats, if this turns out to be a year where they get all the momentum going into Election Day and the bottom drops out on the Republicans, all 3 of these Republican candidates are going to be vulnerable.
Bob Benison, who covers politics for CQPolitics.com, and we'll be partnering with C-SPAN on a new website that we'll be talking about later this summer. But if you want to follow the campaign tonight, you can log on to CQPolitics.com, and we'll let you get back to your office down the street to monitor the race for your website. Thank you, sir.
Great. Thank you, Steve.
And let me tell you what we'll be doing during the course of the evening. We'll go to other programming, but about every 10 minutes on the bottom of the screen, we will give you results in the Connecticut Senate race, also Georgia's 4th primary. And we will be partnering with WFSB later this evening to show you how it's playing. And at about 10 o'clock East Coast time, live coverage from the CBS affiliate in Hartford. And, of course, victory and concession speeches from